In 2014, on the north shore of Kauai, near the small town of Kilauea, surveyors stood on windswept pastures looking down toward Pilaa Bay. The old ranch land that would soon be folded into Ko'olau Ranch still carried the traces of its past: low stone terraces, rusted fencing, the outline of a dam and reservoir that once watered cane and cattle. On a county planning map, a new name had been penciled in beside the parcel numbers, an LLC linked to Mark Zuckerberg, the billionaire founder of Facebook. In the archives of Kauai County, the first building permits show little more than lines and symbols, rectangles for future mansions, an access road, a water tank. The ocean light on the stone, the sound of waves just beyond, the cool shadow beneath what would become a wooden gate, all promise permanence. Yet even here, on land once governed by communal systems older than private property itself, nothing built is ever beyond time. On a humid afternoon in 1848, long before any tech billionaire imagined a fortress on Kauai's north shore, Hawaiian chiefs and advisors gathered to formalize the Great Mahel, the division that introduced Western-style private land ownership to the islands. The process was methodical, deliberate, and irreversible. Clerks inscribed boundaries onto maps, translating centuries of ahupua'a land divisions into parcels that could be bought, sold, and taxed according to American legal frameworks. The lands above Pilaa and what would later be known as Larson's Beach were carved into units, each assigned numbers and acreage, each transformed from collective trust into individual commodity. The afternoon light that day would have filtered through the windows of the meeting halls in Honolulu, illuminating the documents that remade the relationship between Hawaiians and their land. The sound of quills scratching parchment, the rustle of papers being shuffled and stacked, the low murmur of translation between Hawaiian and English, these acoustic details are lost to time, but their consequences echo through every land dispute that followed. By the 1850s, the Kuleana Act extended this transformation, allowing native Hawaiian tenants to claim small plots on land they had long worked. These Kuleana parcels, sometimes only a few acres, sometimes less, were embedded like islands within larger estates. They passed through generations, often without formal deeds but with shared memory, oral testimony, and genealogies recited at family gatherings. A grandmother might point to a particular gulch or stand of trees and say, "That belonged to your great-great-grandfather," and the claim would be as real as any document filed in Honolulu. The legal architecture of these holdings was intentionally complex. Fractional ownership meant that as families grew and heirs multiplied, a single Kuleana parcel might have dozens of co-owners, each holding a percentage so small it seemed almost abstract: 1/16th, 1/32nd, 1/64th of an acre. Yet each fraction carried the same moral weight: a connection to ancestors, a stake in the land, and crucially, a legal right to access that land even when it was surrounded by someone else's property. Through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, sugar plantations and ranches reshaped the north shore of Kauai. Cone fields crept down toward the sea, their boundaries marked by irrigation ditches and the skeletal frames of processing mills. The Koloko Reservoir System and others like it turned water into capital, capturing rainfall in engineered basins and releasing it according to the rhythms of cultivation rather than nature. The soundscape of this shore shifted from wind and waves to the clatter of mills, the lowing of cattle, and the rumble of trucks hauling raw sugar to ports. Where the future privacy walls of Ko'olau Ranch would stand, fence posts and cattle gates once marked working land rather than exclusive views. Ranch hands drove herds along dirt roads that are now paved and posted with private property signs. The texture underfoot was red volcanic soil, sometimes muddy, sometimes baked hard, always bearing the marks of use: hoofprints, tire tracks, the shallow channels worn by decades of rain runoff. In county archives today, early 20th century survey maps and land commission awards show thin inked boundaries across parcels that would eventually be consolidated into Zuckerberg's holdings. The maps are yellowed now, fragile, stored in climate-controlled rooms where researchers wear gloves to turn the pages. The ink has faded in places, making some boundaries ambiguous, subject to interpretation and legal argument. In oral histories collected by Hawaiian cultural practitioners, descendants recall burial grounds in the uplands, places where family members were laid to rest long before zoning codes or environmental impact statements. These graves were often unmarked by Western standards, identified instead by native plants, stone arrangements, or simply by memory passed from one generation to the next. The protocol for approaching such sites involved prayer, offerings, and respect, a cultural architecture as important as any physical structure, yet invisible on property maps. Recent reporting confirms that part of Zuckerberg's current holdings sit atop known native Hawaiian burial sites. Aerial photographs show a modest fence enclosing one documented area associated with the family of Julian Ako. The fence is simple: metal posts, wire mesh, perhaps 4 feet high. Inside, the ground is left undisturbed, a small island of intentional neglect within a landscape of careful management. Grass grows taller there. Native shrubs are left unpruned. The fence acknowledges presence without fully engaging with meaning. The chapter closes not on the billionaire, but on the land itself. Afternoon light slants across old stone terraces that predate both the ranch and the compound. The rough texture of weathered basalt, shaped by hands long dead, holds the day's warmth even as evening approaches. The faint echo of distant surf reaches the uplands, a rhythm that has not changed in centuries, indifferent to the legal documents that claim to define ownership. Before any wall, before any wooden gate, the most important architecture here was invisible, the legal and spiritual structure that linked people, plots, and ancestors. The Mahele and Kuleana Act created a landscape of overlapping claims and embedded rights, a terrain that could not be simply purchased and enclosed. Every large estate built in Hawaii since 1848 has had to navigate this complexity, and Kauai Ranch would be no exception. The question was not whether the past would intrude on the present, but when and how visibly. In late 2014, real estate records in Honolulu quietly registered a transaction that would reshape a stretch of Kauai's North Shore. Nearly 700 to 750 acres near the small town of Kauai sold for approximately $100 million to limited liability companies whose ultimate ownership traced back to Mark Zuckerberg, the 30-year-old founder of Facebook. The land still looked like open pasture and scrub when the sale closed. Cattle grazed, wind bent the grass, ironwood trees cast their long shadows in the afternoon light. But on paper, it had become something else entirely, the seed of one of the most expensive private compounds on Earth. Inside a law office in Honolulu, deeds and title reports stacked up on conference tables. Attorneys reviewed chains of title reaching back through decades of ranch ownership, checking for liens, easements, and those troublesome Kuleana parcels embedded within the larger parcel. Each document was a thread in a legal tapestry that would take years to fully untangle. The process was methodical, expensive, and necessary, evidence of a new kind of plantation, one that harvested not sugar or cattle, but privacy itself. The buyer was already a public figure, his face recognizable worldwide, his company a daily presence in billions of lives. Yet the purchase was structured to maintain distance between the individual and the property. Limited liability companies with anodyne names served as the legal owners, a common practice among wealthy landholders seeking to minimize tax exposure and maintain confidentiality. Public records would eventually connect these entities to Zuckerberg, but the corporate veil added a layer of abstraction, a buffer between person and place. By 2015 and 2016, Zuckerberg-linked entities added roughly 600 more acres for approximately $53 million. These parcels included portions of a working cattle ranch and, critically, access to Playa Beach, a stretch of shoreline known for its beauty and relative seclusion. Hawaiian law guarantees public access to beaches, but when the easiest path crosses private property, access becomes theoretical for many residents, especially those without vehicles capable of navigating rough alternate routes. A 2021 purchase added another 110 acres for $17 million. By the mid-2020s, the total holdings exceeded 2,300 acres, making Zuckerberg one of the largest private landowners on an island where land is both scarce and sacred. Each acquisition added another line to the county records, another parcel shaded on the master map of Kauai Ranch. The accumulation was strategic, filling in gaps, securing boundaries, eliminating the possibility of neighboring development that might compromise the estate's isolation. In these years, Zuckerberg's public persona evolved. The hoodie-clad startup founder gave way to the family man and philanthropist, photographed in more polished settings, speaking about connection and community in carefully crafted public statements. Yet the architectural form his wealth chose in Kauai evoked an older template, that of Gilded Age tycoons building Biltmore or Fifth Avenue palaces as physical proofs of success and permanence. The difference was context and scale. Where 19th-century mansions rose amid factories and tenements, visible symbols of industrial capitalism's hierarchy, this 21st-century complex rose on a rural island with a population of roughly 70,000, where median household incomes hovered around 70,000 and housing costs had been rising faster than wages for decades. The gap between the buyer's wealth, measured in tens of billions, and the local economy was so vast it almost defied comprehension, a financial chasm that no amount of philanthropy could fully bridge. A real estate brochure from before Zuckerberg's purchase, preserved in online archives, once advertised the ranchland's potential for luxury development. Architectural renderings showed dozens of homes cascading down the hillside toward the ocean, each with Pacific views, each priced to attract mainland buyers seeking a Hawaiian retreat. The previous owner had secured permits for this subdivision, a project that would have brought construction jobs, property taxes, and a new cohort of part-time residents to the area. Zuckerberg's purchase canceled that plan, replacing many houses for many owners with a single, sprawling estate for one family and its guests. Supporters would later frame this as preservation, an act that saved open space from subdivision, kept the coastline less developed, and maintained the rural character of the area. Critics saw consolidation, the concentration of enormous acreage in the hands of one individual, limiting future access and opportunity for a community already struggling with affordability and displacement. Both interpretations held truth, and neither fully captured the complexity. The light off the ocean filtered through the old ironwood trees, just as it had before the sale, indifferent to the legal structures that now claimed dominion. The sound of cattle lowing in the pastures continued, though the herd would soon be managed according to new protocols, part of a vision that blended ranching with luxury, living. Wild chickens scratched in the underbrush, feral descendants of domestic flocks, their presence a reminder that no property, however carefully managed, is ever fully controlled. Surveyors walked the land with GPS units and laser levels, establishing the coordinates for future construction. Their voices carried faintly across the pastures fragments of technical language, benchmark, elevation, setback, that translated vision into physical reality. The land itself was unchanged, the same volcanic soil and native rock, the same trade winds and seasonal rains, but the legal and financial superstructure above it had been transformed entirely, a new architecture of ownership that would soon manifest in stone, steel, and concrete. By 2017 and 2018, in conference rooms far from the trade winds and surf of Kauai, architects, engineers, and consultants pored over planning documents for what would become the core of Kauai Ranch. The plans were detailed, technical, and when later obtained through public records requests and published by Wired in 2023, surprisingly revealing. What emerged was not simply a luxury home, but an integrated compound designed for resilience, self-sufficiency, and comprehensive security. The core of the estate, according to these planning documents, centers on two main mansions totaling approximately 57,000 square feet, roughly the size of a small museum or large municipal library. The structures would contain at least 30 bedrooms and 30 bathrooms, multiple elevators to navigate the multi-story buildings, a professional-grade kitchen far exceeding typical residential scale, offices and conference rooms suitable for conducting business remotely, and living spaces proportioned to accommodate not just a family, but staff, security personnel, and extended networks of guests. Architectural renderings, reproduced in the Wired investigation, showed buildings that blended contemporary minimalism with nods to Hawaiian plantation architecture. Deep eaves for shade, extensive use of natural materials, large openings to capture breezes. The aesthetic was careful, expensive, and calibrated to signal respect for local tradition while asserting unmistakable modernity. Basalt stone, sourced locally, would form exterior walls. Ironwood and native hardwoods would feature in interior finishes. Glass, steel, and concrete, the universal language of high-end contemporary architecture, would structure the spaces within. Around the main residences, the plans detailed a constellation of supporting structures. A gym building would house pools, a sauna, hot tub, cold plunge, and tennis court, the standard amenities of wealthy resort living compressed into private facilities. Guest houses scattered across the property would accommodate visitors without requiring them to share space with the primary family. Operations buildings would house maintenance equipment, storage, and quarters for staff whose labor keeps the compound functioning, but whose presence is meant to remain discreet. Perhaps most striking was a network of 11 disc-shaped tree houses, linked by rope bridges, threaded through a grove of ironwood trees. The tree houses suggested playfulness, a retreat within a retreat, elevated platforms from which to observe the landscape without being observed. Each structure would be small, perhaps 200 to 400 square feet, but meticulously crafted with custom joinery and concealed mechanical systems. The rope bridges evoked adventure, though engineered to meet safety codes that would govern every inch of construction. Beneath this pastoral language of ranch and retreat lay a more serious infrastructure. Planning documents described a 55-foot wide, 18-foot tall water tank, a reservoir capable of holding hundreds of thousands of gallons, ensuring water independence in case of drought, pipeline failure, or extended emergency. Pump systems, filtration, and backup generators formed an integrated network designed to function off-grid if necessary. Solar panels would supplement or replace grid power. The ranch's ongoing cattle operation would provide not just pastoral ambiance, but a working food source, integrated with vegetable gardens and orchards planned for other sections of the property. Most revealing was a tunnel connecting the two main houses, branching into an approximately 5,000 square foot underground shelter. The documents described living space, mechanical rooms, and a reinforced metal door filled with concrete, what Wired characterized as a style common in bunkers and bomb shelters. The shelter's existence suggested a particular worldview, that catastrophe, whether climate, political, or pandemic, was not merely possible but likely enough to justify significant investment in subterranean refuge. In this architecture, material choices spoke as clearly as any mission statement. Concrete, poured thick and reinforced with rebar, promised durability against wind, water, and time. Basalt, the volcanic stone native to the islands, anchored the buildings to their geology, a visual argument that this was not foreign imposition but organic extension. Steel framing and impact-resistant glass prepared for hurricanes. Layered security systems, cameras, sensors, keypads, and blind doors disguised as walls, promised control over visibility and access, the ability to see without being seen. The phrase, opulent techno-Xanadu, used by Wired to describe the compound, captured something essential, like the fictional palace in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem and its cinematic descendant in Citizen Kane. Kauai Ranch combined immense wealth with isolation, beauty with control, a private world constructed to insulate its inhabitants from the forces that shape ordinary lives. The reference to Xanadu also carried a warning, one the planners may not have intended. That poem ends with the palace as a lost vision, and the film ends with a life of accumulation revealed as fundamentally hollow. In the late 19th century, men like Andrew Carnegie and Cornelius Vanderbilt commissioned palaces that fused industrial wealth with Beaux-Arts splendor. Their mansions boasted ballrooms for 400 guests, libraries housing rare books, and servants' corridors designed to stage power yet conceal labor. Marble was imported from Italy, tapestries from France, craftsmen from across Europe. The mansions were statements in stone: "We have arrived, we will endure. Look upon our works." Kauai Ranch translated that logic into a digital age. Not marble staircases overlooking Fifth Avenue, but reinforced concrete halls overlooking a rural shoreline. Not ballrooms for society, but conference rooms wired to servers an ocean away. Not visible servants' quarters, but NDAs and corporate structures that keep the machinery of maintenance invisible. The ambition was the same, to build a world within the world, subject to its own rules, but the technology and context had changed. At the property entrance, a stone wall and wooden gate would become the compound's most photographed element. Phil Young's image, published by Wired, shows a structure both simple and imposing, rough-cut stone rising 6 feet, capped with a horizontal plane of smoother rock, punctuated by a gate of vertical wooden planks weathered to gray. The light falls differently on this wall at dawn and dusk, sharp shadows in morning, warm glow in evening. The grain of the wood contrasts with the rough stone. The sound, when the gate closes, is soft but decisive, a compression of air and settling of weight that signals transition from public road to private domain. Inside this gate would be an integrated world of energy, food, and data. Outside remained a public road, a coastline shaped by centuries of shared use, and a community watching the wall rise with a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and resignation. In 2016, residents walking or biking along the road near Pila'a Beach began to notice a structure taking shape between them and the ocean. A stone wall, roughly 6 feet tall, was rising along sections of what was now marked as Zuckerberg property. For those who had long enjoyed open views across ranchland to the Pacific, the wall represented a literal and symbolic closing of access, not to the beach itself, which remained legally public, but to the sense of shared landscape that had characterized the area for generations. Local media coverage from this period framed the wall in terms of privacy and noise reduction. Representatives for the estate explained that the structure would buffer road sounds and provide security for the family. From a technical standpoint, the justifications were reasonable. From the perspective of neighbors who had lived on this road for decades, the wall felt like an announcement. This is no longer yours to see. Hope Kauai, a longtime resident, later recalled the experience to reporters with a precision that captured more than visual change. As we walked, suddenly it was stone, she said. The soundscape shifted too. Waves became muffled, their rhythmic crash absorbed or deflected by the mass of rock. In their place came the intermittent rumble of construction trucks, the backup beeping of heavy equipment, the occasional shout of workers directing machinery. The acoustic texture of a rural coastal road was being replaced by the sounds of development, a temporary but intensive transformation that signaled a longer-term change. The wall itself was built from local stone, basalt in various shades of gray and brown, rough-cut and fitted with mortar joints. In Hawaiian architectural history, similar walls had enclosed plantation compounds, marked property boundaries, and terraced agricultural lands. The material carried associations, labor, permanence, colonial imposition. By using local stone rather than imported material, the wall could be read as contextually appropriate, drawing on regional building tradition. Yet the context it referenced was itself a history of enclosure and control, making the architectural gesture more complex than mere aesthetic choice. Photographs from this period form an emerging archive scattered across news articles, personal social media posts, and the eventual Wired investigation. Images show the wall casting sharp shadows on grass, its rough face textured and irregular. The wooden gate set into the wall appears in multiple shots, always closed, always formal, a numbered portal to a place most locals would never enter. The same material that historically enclosed pastures and sugar fields now enclosed a different kind of property. Data-age wealth seeking physical seclusion on an island where seclusion was becoming an increasingly rare and expensive commodity. In the Gilded Age, New York's elites retreated behind high brownstone stoops and wrought iron fences, yet their mansions remained within the city grid, their facades visible to anyone walking Fifth Avenue. On Kauai, the geography offered different possibilities. With enough acreage, a wall could do more than mark a boundary. It could erase an entire estate from casual view. The symbolism remained similar. The mediation of public and private, the assertion of control over landscape, the physical manifestation of wealth's power to reshape space according to individual preference rather than collective interest. Some neighbors spoke to reporters and county officials, voicing concerns that went beyond aesthetics. Blocked breezes were mentioned. The trade winds that made coastal living comfortable were now interrupted by the wall, creating hot spots and dead air on certain stretches of road. Altered views diminished property values for some, or at least changed the character of what it meant to live in this place. The transformation of a quiet rural road into an access corridor for heavy construction equipment brought dust, noise, and increased traffic, disrupting the rhythms of daily life. For families who had chosen this location precisely for its relative quiet. These accounts filtered into newspaper articles, local television segments, and testimony before county planning commissions. They formed a counter-archive to the carefully managed image of Kauai Ranch as an eco-friendly family retreat, a working cattle operation that preserved open space. Both narratives were true in their way, but they reflected profoundly different relationships to the land. For the estate, the wall provided necessary privacy and security. For neighbors, it represented exclusion and the visible assertion of a hierarchy in which their decades of residence counted for less than a recent arrival's wealth. The texture of this divide was not only social but sensory. On one side of the wall, controlled access, manicured grounds, the quiet hum of well-maintained systems. On the other, public roads, variable upkeep, the unfiltered sounds of community life. The wall did not create this divide. It had always existed, latent in economic disparities and different relationships to property. But it made the divide visible, undeniable, a daily reminder etched in stone. County records from this period show scattered complaints and inquiries about permits, setbacks, and height restrictions. The wall complied with zoning codes, the construction followed proper procedures, the legal paperwork was in order. The frustration expressed by neighbors was not primarily about regulatory violation, but about the exercise of legal rights in ways that felt like a betrayal of unwritten social contracts. There had been an understanding, never formalized but deeply felt, that large landowners in rural Kauai balanced their private interests with some acknowledgement of the community's stake in landscape and viewsheds. The wall suggested a different calculus. Private interest superseded community sentiment within the full protection of property law. This was not unique to Kauai Ranch. Across Hawaii, and indeed across many rural areas being reshaped by wealthy newcomers, similar tensions played out. What made this case particularly visible was the scale of the acquisition, the prominence of the buyer, and the eventual media attention that would make a 6-foot wall on a Kauai backroad a subject of international reporting. The wall became a symbol that extended far beyond its immediate function, a focal point for broader anxieties about inequality, access, and who gets to call a place home. In photographs, the wall appears solid, inert, and permanent. In lived experience, it was dynamic, a structure that changed the play of light and wind, altered social relationships, and redefined the meaning of a place. Morning light hit the wall at an oblique angle, emphasizing its texture. The afternoon sun warmed the stone, making it radiate heat into the evening. At night, the wall became a dark mass. Its presence felt more than seen, a boundary enforced as much by absence of light, of visibility, of the ocean, sounds beyond, as by physical presence. The wall made visible what money often keeps invisible, the point at which individual privacy meets communal landscape, and the mechanisms by which wealth reshapes geography according to personal rather than collective needs. It stood as the first major physical manifestation of Kauai Ranch's impact on its surroundings. The legal and financial architecture had been in place since 2014. Now the built environment was catching up, translating LLCs and purchase agreements into stone, wood, and altered sightlines. In December 2016, attorneys representing LLCs linked to Mark Zuckerberg filed a series of quiet title and partition lawsuits in the Fifth Circuit Court of Kauai. The legal actions sought to clarify ownership of small kuleana parcels embedded within the roughly 700 acres acquired in 2014. The cases were technical, procedural, and, in the context of Hawaiian land law, incendiary. Quiet title actions are standard tools in American property law, designed to resolve ambiguous ownership and clear clouds on title. In Hawaii, however, they intersect with the afterlife of the Great Mahel and the Kuleana Act. These 19th-century legal transformations created a landscape of fractional interests, where a single parcel might have dozens or even hundreds of heirs, each holding a tiny percentage inherited through genealogical lines stretching back generations. Many of these heirs no longer lived in Hawaii, or even knew they held an interest. Quiet title lawsuits effectively forced them to come forward and assert their claim or risk losing it, often resulting in court-ordered auctions where parcels were sold to the highest bidder. For families who had maintained connections to these lands through oral tradition and periodic visits, the lawsuits felt like dispossession wrapped in legal formality. The process required documentation, deeds, tax records, proof of continuous interest, that many families either lacked or had never needed before. The burden of proof shifted to descendants, who now had to demonstrate their rightful inheritance within a legal framework designed to favor clear, documented, individual ownership over complex collective genealogical claims. The Guardian, in its coverage, described the lawsuits as making Zuckerberg the face of neocolonialism, arguing that they echoed earlier waves of dispossession that had separated native Hawaiians from their lands. The comparison was pointed. Just as 19th-century legal mechanisms had facilitated the transfer of land from Hawaiian control to American and European ownership, 21st-century quiet title actions, though legally neutral, functioned within a context where wealth, legal expertise, and access to capital were profoundly unequal. Documents from the cases recorded the names of families whose ties to these parcels stretched back to ancestors who had worked the land under Hawaiian kingdom governance. Among those central to the dispute was Carlos Andrade, a retired Hawaiian studies professor who had long lived on and tended one of the Kuleana parcels. Andrade paid property taxes, maintained the land, and embodied the kind of continuous relationship that the Kuleana Act had been designed to protect. His story personalized what might otherwise remain an abstraction. These were not abandoned or forgotten parcels, but living connections between people and place. As Wired later recounted in its 2023 investigation, Andrade ultimately won a 2019 auction for 4 contested parcels, paying more than $2 million, a sum far beyond what the land would fetch in any ordinary market valuation. The price reflected not agricultural value but strategic importance. These parcels held the right of access through the larger estate, a legal easement that could potentially allow non-family members to traverse Ko'olau Ranch's roads and trails. Some relatives alleged that Zuckerberg-linked entities had quietly backed Andrade's bid, providing the financial resources to consolidate the parcels in the hands of someone sympathetic to the estate's need for privacy. Zuckerberg's spokespeople declined to comment specifically on funding, while expressing support for Andrade's connection to the land. As news of the lawsuit spread beyond Kauai, backlash intensified. A petition titled "Stop Mark Zuckerberg from Colonizing Kauai" appeared online and quickly gathered over 1 million signatures. The language was blunt, framing the quiet title actions as a contemporary form of the land seizures that had characterized Hawaiian history since Western contact. Whether the comparison was legally precise mattered less than its emotional resonance. For many signers, the petition was an outlet for frustration with larger patterns of inequality, displacement, and the ways wealth reshapes landscapes according to individual rather than community priorities. In January 2017, under mounting public criticism and media coverage that threatened to associate his name permanently with dispossession, Zuckerberg posted a public statement and wrote an op-ed in the Garden Island, Kauai's local newspaper. He pledged to drop the quiet title actions and work together with the community on a new approach that would respect both property rights and family connections to the land. The language emphasized collaboration, respect for Hawaiian culture, and a commitment to being a good neighbor. Yet even after Zuckerberg's name was removed as plaintiff, corporate entities continued to negotiate with and buy out heirs' fractional interests, gradually consolidating ownership inside the wall. The mechanism shifted from court-ordered auctions to private settlements, less visible but functionally similar. Each heir who sold their interest, often for sums significant to them personally but small relative to the estate's total value, reduced the number of parties with legal claims. Over time, the kuleana parcels were effectively absorbed, their boundaries persisting on old survey maps, but their communal character extinguished. In the late 19th century, American industrialists often secured land for estates through railroad grants, insider deals, or legal maneuvers that converted common resources into private holdings. The instruments have changed, LLCs and quiet title actions replacing land grants and legislative favors, but the dynamic has not. Property law, ostensibly neutral, operates within contexts of profound inequality, and its application can facilitate concentration of ownership even when all procedures are followed correctly. In courtroom corridors in Luhu, the seat of Kauai County, legal papers rustled as attorneys filed briefs and status updates. The sound of these proceedings, the formal language of motions and responses, the shuffling of exhibits, the judge's gavel, replaced momentarily the sound of surf. The texture of this architecture was not stone or steel, but fine print and ink, documents that redrew who belonged where and under what terms. For families involved, the experience was disorienting and often painful. Some had never before needed to prove their relationship to land that everyone in the family simply knew was theirs. The requirement to produce documentation, hire attorneys, and navigate a legal system many found opaque and intimidating added insult to the underlying injury of having their inheritance questioned. Even those who ultimately retained or repurchased their interests described the process as deeply alienating, a bureaucratic assertion that their genealogical and cultural claims needed validation from institutions that had historically undermined precisely those forms of knowledge. The quiet title controversy became the most widely reported aspect of Ko'olau Ranch's development, the moment when local tensions broke through into national and international media. It marked Zuckerberg's Kauai project not just as an expensive real estate acquisition, but as a flashpoint in ongoing debates about wealth, colonialism, and who has the right to shape a place. The stone wall might be the compound's most visible feature, but the quiet title lawsuits revealed its most contested foundation, the legal architecture that allowed one individual to consolidate ownership over lands whose history was fundamentally collective. By the early 2020s, public descriptions of Ko'olau Ranch emphasized a particular narrative. This was not merely a luxury estate, but a working ranch, a conservation project, and a family retreat designed for self-sufficiency. Zuckerberg's Instagram posts showed him and his young daughters tending cattle, a visual strategy that grounded immense wealth in the pastoral imagery of agricultural labor. Interviews described his ambition to raise Wagyu and Angus cattle on a diet that included macadamia meal and beer, producing what he characterized as the most delicious beef, grown on the property's pastures and consumed primarily by family and guests. The language of ranching carried specific cultural weight in Hawaii, where large cattle operations had shaped landscapes and economies since the early 19th century. Presenting Ko'olau as a ranch rather than simply a compound suggested continuity with this history, positioning Zuckerberg as steward rather than interloper, participant in a working landscape rather than mere consumer of views. The cattle were real, the ranching operation genuine. Yet the scale and purpose were fundamentally different from commercial operations that supplied local meat markets or export channels. This was ranching as a hobby, as a lifestyle, as a form of self-reliance that required subsidies from wealth generated elsewhere. Planning documents and media reports revealed that the ranch functioned as an integrated system extending far beyond agriculture. Underground lines tied the 55-foot-wide water tank, pump networks, and power systems to the mansions and underground shelter. The infrastructure was designed for resilience. If grid power failed, solar arrays and generators would continue operation. If municipal water was compromised, the estate's reservoir and wells could sustain the compound indefinitely. The cattle, gardens, and orchards formed a food system capable of supporting residents without external supply chains. Security systems layered throughout the property created concentric zones of access control. Cameras monitored entry points and perimeters. Keypads required codes that could be remotely updated. Interior design documents described blind doors, passages concealed as walls, indistinguishable from surrounding surfaces except to those who knew their location. These features, common in high-security installations, allowed movement through the compound along routes invisible to guests or unauthorized persons. The architecture enforced hierarchy. Some people could go anywhere, others were confined to designated areas, and the structure itself became an instrument of surveillance and control. The tree houses, with their rope bridges threading through ironwood groves, offered a different kind of control, elevation, and perspective. From these platforms, 20 or 30 feet above ground, sight lines extended across the property and toward the ocean. The vantage points were playful, designed for children, but they also served as observational posts, places from which to watch without being easily watched. The rope bridges swayed slightly underfoot, adding physical sensation to movement between trees, an engineered adventure that remained entirely within the bounds of private property. In 2023, Wired's investigation into the construction of Kauai Ranch included interviews with former contractors that revealed a workplace culture marked by secrecy and legal intimidation. One contractor described the project as operating like Fight Club, a reference to the fictional rule, "You don't talk about Fight Club." Non-disclosure agreements bound workers to silence about project details, construction methods, and even accidents. The NDAs created an information asymmetry. The estate knew everything about its workers, but workers could share almost nothing about their experience, even in contexts where disclosure might serve safety or public interest. Another local architect, unaffiliated with the project, offered a darker analogy in comments to Wired. He likened the culture of secrecy to medieval rulers who reportedly killed their architects to keep the designs of their fortresses secret. The comparison was hyperbolic. There was no suggestion of physical harm, but it captured a reality about power and information. Those who built the compound were legally prevented from explaining what they had built. Their knowledge turned into a liability they could not discharge without risking legal consequences. In the Gilded Age, technological systems, electric lighting, elevators, private telephones, and steam heating were wrapped in decorative plaster and mahogany, invisible to guests, but central to the experience of comfort and control. Servants understood the workings of these systems, moving through back corridors and service passages to maintain the illusion of effortless luxury. The architecture enforced this separation. Formal spaces were for family and guests, service spaces for workers whose labor was essential, but whose presence was to remain discreet. Kauai Ranch repeated this pattern with 21st-century infrastructure. Fiber optic cables linked the estate to global communications networks. Digital surveillance systems recorded activity across the property. Underground utilities, water, power, data, ran beneath manicured landscapes, invisible except where access points or control panels required surface expression. The storm shelter, described in some public statements as a little shelter or basement, appeared in planning documents in bunker-like terms: reinforced walls, blast-resistant door, independent life support systems. Here, the recurring motif, the wooden gate in the stone wall, took on new meaning. It was not just an aesthetic entrance, but the surface expression of a dense web of systems underneath. Morning light caught the grain of weathered wood, highlighting its texture, and the subtle color variations where exposure to sun and salt air had bleached and darkened different sections. The stone beneath one's hand, if one were allowed to touch it, was cool and rough, shaped by tools but retaining the irregular surface of fractured basalt. The sound of the latch, when the gate opened, echoed faintly, and then was absorbed by gardens irrigated from private water systems, where native and introduced plants grew according to carefully planned aesthetics that required constant maintenance to appear effortlessly natural. The architecture became a kind of interface between the vulnerability of the natural world, hurricanes, droughts, pandemics, social unrest, and the resilience sought through technology and capital, Every system had redundancy, every entrance had alternatives, every visible feature concealed supporting infrastructure. The compound was designed to function as a world unto itself, capable of enduring disruptions that might overwhelm less fortified and self-contained environments. Yet this vision of self-sufficiency contained a paradox. The systems required external inputs: diesel for generators, replacement parts for pumps and solar panels, food staples that even the most ambitious gardens could not fully provide, and crucially, labor. The estate employed dozens of workers: ranch hands, maintenance crews, security personnel, cleaners, gardeners, whose own lives were integrated into the larger Kauai economy. Their housing, healthcare, transportation, and family needs linked the supposedly self-contained compound to the very social systems from which it sought partial insulation. The ranch presented itself as a fortress and sanctuary capable of weathering storms, both meteorological and metaphorical. But storms, as Hawaiian history repeatedly demonstrated, came in forms that no amount of engineering could fully anticipate. Legal challenges, environmental disasters, reputational crises, and the slow erosion of social legitimacy that could turn even the most carefully managed estate into a symbol of something its builders never intended. From 2018 onward, another archive grew alongside building permits and construction documents, press releases, and grant announcements from the Zuckerberg Kauai Community Fund. Reports indicated that since the fund's establishment, it had distributed over $20 million to local nonprofits, supporting education programs, conservation initiatives, healthcare services, and social support networks. The grants were real money, supporting real programs, making tangible differences in the operations of organizations often operating on thin margins. In 2018 and again in 2021, when Kauai faced flooding from heavy storms and the economic devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic, Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan met with Mayor Derek Kawakami. The meetings resulted in substantial donations, millions of dollars for jobs programs to employ residents whose tourism sector work had evaporated, relief efforts to support families struggling with housing and food security, and public health initiatives responding to the pandemic. Press photographs from these meetings showed Zuckerberg and Chan in casual attire, seated across from county officials at conference tables, discussing needs and responses with apparent sincerity. The couple also funded the purchase of a historic Hawaiian fish pond managed by the nonprofit Malama Hulea. The fish pond represented a different model of landscape management, loko aya, traditional aquaculture systems that supported native Hawaiian communities for centuries before Western contact. Supporting their restoration aligned Zuckerberg's philanthropy with indigenous cultural practice, offering a narrative of connection rather than imposition, of learning from rather than overriding local knowledge. Yet, simultaneously, Ko'olau Ranch hired Errol Kanshiro, then chair of the Kauai County Council, as an agricultural consultant. Ethics filings showed that Kanshiro's consulting business earned more than $100,000 during the period of his engagement with the estate. The arrangement was legal. County council members could maintain private business interests if properly disclosed, but it raised questions about proximity of political power to private development. Kanshiro was not a voting member on land use decisions directly affecting Ko'olau Ranch, but his position as council chair gave him significant influence over county priorities, budgets, and the broader political environment in which the estate operated. In the Gilded Age, magnates often paired grand estates with conspicuous philanthropy, endowing libraries, universities, concert halls, and museums. Andrew Carnegie's libraries dotted American cities. John D. Rockefeller funded the University of Chicago. These donations were genuine contributions to public welfare, yet they also functioned as reputation management, softening criticism of monopolistic business practices and labor conditions. The magnates argued that private wealth, strategically deployed, could serve public good more effectively than government bureaucracy or collective action. Their critics countered that such philanthropy was a way of choosing which public goods to support, maintaining control even in the act of giving. On Kauai, Zuckerberg's philanthropy followed a similar pattern. Donations to schools, wetlands, and relief efforts existed alongside accusations of neo-colonialism and displacement related to land purchases. The wall and the grants were not contradictory, but complementary expressions of the same power, the ability to reshape landscape and community according to individual priorities within legal frameworks that protected property rights and encouraged charitable giving through tax benefits. Local voices captured this duality with precision. Some residents, interviewed by reporters, credited Zuckerberg for jobs created through ranch operations, construction contracts with local firms, and charitable support that kept nonprofits functioning during economic downturns. They pointed to his decision to purchase the inland parcel that previous owners had intended to subdivide into 80 luxury homes, an acquisition that, whatever its motivations, did prevent that particular form of development and maintained a larger block of undeveloped land. Others saw the accumulation of acreage, now exceeding 2,300 acres, more than 3.5 square miles, as part of a broader process squeezing longtime islanders out of the places they had called home. "People born and raised here can't afford to live here," one resident observed, a statement that applied to housing markets across Hawaii, but felt particularly acute when juxtaposed with one individual's ability to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a private retreat. Douglas Rushkoff, a media theorist quoted in Wired, framed Kauai Ranch as the logical endpoint of what he called the mindset. The belief that money and technology can insulate individuals from systemic crises. In this view, the compound was not an aberration, but a concentrated expression of assumptions that shaped Silicon Valley culture, that problems are solvable through engineering and capital, that preparation trumps solidarity, and that those with resources have not just the right, but perhaps the duty to secure their own futures against chaos. The underground bunker became, in this reading, a physical manifestation of a philosophical stance that valued personal resilience over collective transformation. The gate in the wall thus functioned as more than a security feature. It symbolized selective access, not only to land and ocean views, but to philanthropic attention and political relationships. Organizations that received grants found themselves in a complex position, genuinely grateful for support that made their work possible, yet aware that the same donor controlled vast resources that could reshape the island's future in ways beyond any nonprofit's influence to affect. The power dynamic was asymmetric. The estate could choose which causes to support, which community needs to address, and which voices to engage, while the community could only respond to initiatives already determined elsewhere. The sound of the gate closing echoed in other registers: NDAs that silenced workers, legal structures that obscured ownership, and the quiet influence that vast wealth could exert through philanthropy, employment, and political connections. None of these mechanisms was inherently corrupt. Each operated within legal and social norms governing private property, charitable giving, and contractual relationships. Yet their cumulative effect was to create layers of mediation between the estate and accountability, buffers that made it difficult to assess impacts or challenge decisions. Photographs from community events sometimes showed Zuckerberg and Chan interacting with residents, serving food at shelters, visiting schools that received grants. The images were genuine, but also carefully managed, visual evidence of engagement that could be circulated as proof of good intentions. The sensory experience these photographs could not fully convey was the texture of these interactions, the warmth or awkwardness of handshakes, the tone of voice in brief exchanges, the body language that signaled whether engagement was authentic dialogue or carefully staged performance. The philanthropy was real, the jobs were real, the grants supported genuine needs, yet they existed within a context where the power to give was also the power to shape, and where the same legal and financial structures that protected the estate's privacy also limited transparency about its broader impacts. The gate opened for those invited in, for those whose work served estate needs, for those whose organizations received support. For others, it remained closed, a wooden barrier set in stone, a symbol of access controlled and conferred rather than shared as common right. In 2024, investigative reporting revealed that Zuckerberg's most recent land acquisition, nearly 962 additional acres, purchased for approximately $65 million, bringing total holdings above 2,300 acres, included terrain containing known native Hawaiian burial sites. The land had been acquired from the estate of Ben Damon, a local rancher whose family had owned the parcel for generations. Prior owners had recognized the cultural significance of certain areas, but the transition of ownership raised questions about how burial sites would be managed under new stewardship. Sources close to the transaction, speaking to Wired, confirmed that Zuckerberg's team had fenced and maintained at least one documented grave area associated with the family of Julian Ako. The enclosure was modest, wire fencing, perhaps 4 feet high, marking a perimeter around a small plot where the earth showed subtle depressions and where, according to family oral history and some archival documentation, ancestors had been interred. The fence kept grazing cattle out, prevented erosion from foot traffic, and signaled to estate workers that this area required different protocols than surrounding ranch land. Yet, oral histories suggested that more graves might lie within the larger property, unmarked by fences or monuments, their locations preserved in family memory, but not always documented in the written records that typically guide land management decisions. Hawaiian burial practices varied by period and region, but many graves were intentionally unmarked, reflecting beliefs about privacy in death and the integration of ancestors into landscape rather than their segregation in bounded cemeteries. Archaeological surveys might locate some of these sites, but others could remain undetected until construction or grading inadvertently exposed them. This possibility sharpened the moral geometry of the estate. On planning maps, the fenced burial area might appear as a shaded polygon with a notation like cultural preserve or no disturbance zone. On the ground, it was earth and stone, grass and memory, a place where the estate's ambitions encountered limits that no amount of engineering or legal maneuvering could fully resolve. The texture of the soil inside the fence was no different from that beneath the mansion's foundations. The same volcanic composition, the same moisture content, the same capacity to grow grass and support buildings. Yet its meaning was entirely distinct, governed not by property law, but by cultural protocols and family connections that long predated any deed or title report. Across Hawaii, burial grounds and heiau, temples, lie beneath modern infrastructure, roads, hotels, shopping centers, parking lots. The tension between development and ancestral respect is long-standing, sharpened by legal frameworks that require developers to address known burial sites but provide less protection for those undiscovered or undocumented. State law establishes procedures for when human remains are found, including notification of the State Historic Preservation Division and consultation with cultural descendants. But the system relies on detection and on the willingness of those who make discoveries to report them, rather than quietly rebury or relocate remains to avoid construction delays. At Kauai Ranch, this tension intersected with the project's culture of secrecy. Workers bound by NDAs might hesitate to report accidental discoveries of remains, unsure whether disclosure would be seen as breach of confidentiality or as proper protocol. Some community advocates, aware of the estate's emphasis on privacy and control of information, worried that potential fines might be routed into internal processes rather than the public consultation that Hawaiian cultural practitioners preferred. The fear was not necessarily that remains would be mistreated. Zuckerberg's representatives emphasized compliance with all cultural and environmental regulations, but that the process would be opaque, managed within corporate structures that prioritized efficiency and confidentiality over communal involvement in decisions about ancestral care. Zuckerberg's team, for their part, pointed to collaboration with local cultural experts, consultation with lineal descendants where they could be identified, and careful maintenance of the known burial area. These were more than token gestures. They represented genuine effort to navigate a complex cultural landscape respectfully. Yet respect mediated through corporate structures and legal compliance differed from the kind of relationship to ancestral sites that many Hawaiian families sought. one based on regular access, ceremonial protocol, and ongoing dialogue rather than one-time consultation followed by managed separation. The visual contrast could not be more stark. On one part of the property, the main compound with its stone walls, wooden gates, and the meticulously maintained grounds visible in aerial photographs. On another part, a simple wire fence around a patch of earth where grass grows taller and volunteers might come periodically to weed, leave offerings, or simply sit in connection with ancestors. The same afternoon, sun illuminates both areas. The same trade winds blow across both. The sound of wind through ironwood trees is identical. Yet the meaning of these spaces and the protocols governing access and use operate according to entirely different logics. Architectural ambition at Kauai Ranch, its tunnels, tree houses, underground shelters, and integrated systems, rests on land where others had intended their loved ones to remain undisturbed across generations. This is not unique to this estate or even to Hawaii. Almost any significant construction project eventually encounters prior human presence, whether burial sites, archaeological remains, or the foundations of earlier structures. What distinguishes each case is how that encounter is managed, whether with transparency or secrecy, with communal input or internal decision-making, with adaptation or defiance. The burial sites represented a limit that even unlimited wealth could not fully transcend. Property ownership, however legally secure, did not confer the right to ignore ancestors. Cultural protocols, even when not codified in law, carried moral weight that public opinion could enforce. The fenced grave became a small monument to constrained power, an acknowledgement that some aspects of land could not be fully possessed, some histories could not be erased, and some claims predated and potentially superseded the claims established through purchase and deed. Definitive answers remained scarce. How many graves lay within the property boundaries? Were protocols for their care adequate from the perspective of cultural practitioners and descendant families? Would future construction or landscaping respect these sites, or would the pressure to develop according to architectural vision eventually override commitments to preservation? These questions lingered, unanswerable without continued observation and ongoing dialogue. What remained visible was the modest fence, photographed from roads and trails at the property's edges, its wire glinting in certain light, its presence a quiet assertion that this land's history was not solely Zuckerberg's to narrate. The earth inside held bodies that had been placed there with ceremony and intention in periods when this coast was governed by Ali'i and Ahupua'a systems rather than county zoning codes and LLC registrations. Those bodies, and the genealogies they anchored, formed an alternative architecture beneath and beyond the compound's visible structures, one that neither time nor money could fully demolish or incorporate. On a steep, narrow access road inside Kauai Ranch in February 2023, a crane being transported downhill lost control and slipped off an embankment. The crane's operator, a 53-year-old Kauai native with decades of heavy equipment experience, was injured in the accident and subsequently hospitalized. According to spokespeople for the estate, he survived, recovered, and eventually returned to work. The incident, reported briefly in local media and later detailed in Wired's investigation, underscored the physical risks inherent in building a mega-project on rugged volcanic terrain where slopes are steep, roads narrow, and weather can shift rapidly. The accident was not isolated. Construction projects of this scale inevitably involve dangerous work, earth moving, concrete pouring, steel erection, and operation of heavy machinery on grades that stress equipment tolerances. The north shore of Kauai is beautiful precisely because its topography is dramatic. Ridges drop sharply to the ocean, gullies channel rainfall into flash streams, and the same slopes that create stunning views also create engineering challenges. Building here requires specialized equipment, skilled operators, and constant attention to safety protocols. When those protocols fail or when conditions exceed design parameters, people get hurt. An earlier tragedy had already marked the project's history with a death that remains contested in its details and meaning. On August 27, 2019, Rodney Medeiros, a 70-year-old security guard working at the property under an NDA, suffered a heart attack while climbing a steep trail from Palaa Beach back to his post after completing a 12-hour shift. The weather that evening was rainy, the trail slippery and difficult even in daylight. An ATV that might normally have ferried him up the slope could not navigate the muddy conditions safely. Medeiros climbed on foot. At some point during or shortly after the ascent, he collapsed. He was transported to Wilcox Medical Center in La Hue, where he died hours later. Court documents from the wrongful death lawsuit filed by Medeiros' family reveal layers of frustration and unanswered questions. Family members struggled to obtain detailed information about the circumstances of his final hours. They encountered what they perceived as efforts to control the narrative, to limit what could be said publicly, and to manage the incident through corporate communication protocols that prioritized liability protection over transparency. A recorded conversation, cited in Wired's reporting, captured a security manager explaining that he wanted to speak directly with the family, but had been blocked by supervisors who insisted all communication flow through official channels. The sensory world of Medeiros' death was starkly different from the marketing images of serene pastures and golden sunsets that characterized public presentations of Kauai Ranch. Instead, rain-slick mud underfoot, the physical strain of steep ascent after hours of standing watch, darkness or near darkness depending on how late his shift ran, the isolation of a trail where help might be minutes or longer away. The sound would have been rain on leaves, his own labored breathing, perhaps the distant surf below. When he collapsed, there would have been only the rain, the trail, and whatever radio communication could be established to summon assistance. Large estates have always depended on invisible labor. In 19th-century Gilded Age mansions, servant staircases and back corridors kept cooks, maids, footmen, and porters out of sight, allowing the illusion that grand dinners materialized effortlessly and that rooms cleaned themselves. The architectural separation was both physical and social. Service spaces were narrow, utilitarian, poorly lit and ventilated, while formal spaces were expansive, ornate, and comfortable. Injuries and illnesses among staff rarely entered the official architectural record. No plaques commemorated the workers who fell from ladders, suffered burns in kitchens, or developed respiratory ailments from cleaning chemicals. At Kauai Ranch, non-disclosure agreements and corporate communication protocols played a similar role, shaping what became publicly known about worker safety. The NDAs bound not just what could be said, but to whom and when, creating legal barriers to the kind of informal communication, one worker telling another, a family member sharing experiences with journalists, that often brings safety issues to broader attention. When accidents occurred, information flowed through managed channels, carefully worded statements that acknowledged incidents while minimizing detail and deflecting questions about systemic factors that might have contributed. Medeiros, according to accounts assembled from court filings and interviews, was a contracted security worker brought in specifically when Zuckerberg was visiting the property. His role was to maintain perimeter security, likely watching access points and shoreline areas where photographers or curious beachgoers might attempt to observe or photograph the estate. He was 70 years old, past typical retirement age, still working, presumably because he needed the income or valued the employment. The 12-hour shift suggests a security posture that required continuous presence rather than periodic patrols. The steep trail from beach level to the main compound represented a daily physical challenge that might have been routine for a younger worker, but potentially taxing for someone his age, especially in poor weather after a long shift. The wooden gate motif returns here through absence. Gates control who enters, but they also shape how people leave. For guests and family, departure meant vehicles, paved roads, and easy egress. For workers like Medeiros, departure meant trails, foot traffic, and physical exertion proportionate to one's role and location. The architecture of access was hierarchical, not just in symbolic terms but in material consequences. Some people's paths through the estate were engineered for comfort and efficiency. Others were not. The aftermath of Medeiros' death involved legal proceedings typical of wrongful death cases, investigations, depositions, negotiations, and ultimately some form of settlement whose terms likely included confidentiality clauses that prevented family members from discussing details publicly. The legal process provided a mechanism for assigning financial responsibility, but not necessarily for public accountability or systemic change. The estate could settle, improve protocols, and continue operations without addressing broader questions about the ethics of employment relationships structured around secrecy and unequal power. Both accidents, the crane, operator's injury, and Medeiros' death, were treated as individual incidents rather than windows into patterns. Perhaps they were isolated events, products of specific circumstances unlikely to recur. Or perhaps they reflected predictable consequences of building and maintaining a vast private compound with security requirements that shaped working conditions in ways that increased risk for those whose labor made the estate function. The echo of a falling crane, the metallic screech as steel slid against earth, would have carried across the compound, audible to anyone working nearby. The sound would be remembered by those who heard it, a moment when danger became real, when the routine work of construction suddenly revealed its potential for catastrophe. Similarly, the radio call reporting Medeiros' medical emergency would have been heard by security personnel across the network, a brief burst of urgent traffic that broke whatever routine had characterized that shift, turning an ordinary evening into one marked by loss. These sounds, crane metal scraping rock, panicked radio calls, the hollow echo of emergency response, were as much part of Kauai Ranch's acoustic landscape as the surf and trade winds featured in any promotional material. They just were not recorded for public consumption, not memorialized in photographs or site tours, not integrated into the narrative of family retreat and sustainable ranching. They belonged to the parallel world of labor that kept the estate functioning, visible primarily in workers' compensation filings, incident reports, and court documents whose details remained largely shielded from public view. By the mid-2020s, Kauai Ranch was no longer unique in the landscape of billionaire land acquisition. News stories increasingly placed Zuckerberg alongside other ultra-wealthy figures building private retreats. Larry Ellison, the Oracle founder who purchased roughly 98% of the Hawaiian island of Lanai in 2012, for a reported $300 million. Jeff Bezos accumulating properties on Maui and in Florida's Indian Creek, an exclusive enclave sometimes called Billionaire Bunker. Tech and finance elites constructing fortified compounds in New Zealand, attracted by the country's geographic isolation and political stability. A pattern had emerged, visible to anyone tracking these acquisitions. Private fortresses in places once shaped by communal land use, or at least by more distributed ownership, with local economies increasingly oriented toward serving distant fortunes. The phenomenon had precedents: robber barons building Newport estates, Hollywood stars colonizing Hawaiian coastlines in the mid-20th century, but its 21st century expression combined unprecedented wealth concentration with technologies of isolation that made older forms of retreat seem quaint by comparison. On Kauai specifically, the combination of limited housing stock, tourism-driven employment, and rapidly appreciating land values had been pushing longtime residents toward difficult choices for years before Zuckerberg's arrival. The pattern was clear in census data and real estate records. Families who had lived on the island for generations were selling properties they could no longer afford to maintain, moving to Oahu or the mainland, watching their children relocate for lack of employment opportunities that paid enough to cover rent. The displacement was gradual, incremental, not a single dramatic event, but an accumulation of individual decisions shaped by economic forces beyond any one person's control. Residents interviewed near the Zuckerberg estate spoke of this reality with the precision that comes from lived experience. Children who grew up swimming at Pilea Beach now live in Las Vegas or Oregon, priced out of their birthplace. Rents that had been manageable a decade earlier now consumed half or more of household income. Houses that once sold for amounts attainable by working families now commanded prices possible only for mainland buyers or investors. The island's beauty and appeal, the very qualities that made it desirable, drove market dynamics that reshaped who could afford to call it home. It's crazy that a man not from Hawaii comes here and purchases a bunch of land that limits the locals from potentially buying land, one former estate worker told Wired, capturing a frustration that extended beyond Zuckerberg to a broader system in which wealth generated globally could rewrite local geographies. The statement was not about individual malice, but structural power. How market forces, property rights, and wealth inequality combined to enable transformations that most residents could observe but not affect. In the Gilded Age, the great estates eventually met forms of decline that their builders had not anticipated. Many were demolished as property taxes climbed and urban land values made single-family palatial use economically indefensible. The Vanderbilt Mansion at 5th Avenue and 51st Street, completed in 1882 at a cost of $3 million equivalent to roughly $90 million today, was demolished in 1926, 44 years of existence, less than half a century. The building had been designed to last forever, its limestone facade and steel frame engineered for permanence. What its builders had not fully accounted for was changing tax structures, inheritance patterns that divided fortunes, and urban development pressures that made enormous single-family residences untenable. Other estates survived through conversion, turned into museums, schools, or event venues where their ballrooms hosted conferences and their gardens welcomed paying visitors. The Newport mansions, once symbols of exclusivity, became tourist attractions, their grandeur preserved precisely because they were opened rather than kept private. The architecture endured, but its meaning transformed from fortress of privilege to democratic spectacle, spaces where anyone with an admission ticket could walk, rooms once reserved for society's apex. Kauai Ranch, as of the mid-2020s, remained in its ascendant phase. The mansions stood new, their systems recently installed and functioning within design parameters. The tree houses were completed or nearing completion, the underground shelter freshly poured and sealed. Cattle grazed, gardens grew, and the infrastructure hummed with the confidence of recent engineering. Nothing had yet cracked or settled or revealed the kinds of flaws that time brings to even the most carefully executed construction. Yet, signs of fragility were already present, visible not in the buildings, but in public sentiment. The million-signature petition, the critical op-eds, and investigative articles like Wired's Deep Dive formed an archive of skepticism that would outlast any public relations effort. The quiet title controversy remained a defining episode, the moment when legal maneuvering intended to clarify ownership instead clarified the vast gulf between property law and community values. Even residents who praised the jobs and donations acknowledged an unease, a sense that something about the scale and nature of the compound felt misaligned with island life. Douglas Rushkoff's concept of the mindset, the belief that individual preparation and technological solutions could insulate the wealthy from systemic collapse, found physical expression at Kauai Ranch in ways that made the compound legible as ideology rather than mere real estate. The underground shelter was not just a basement, but a worldview, a bet that catastrophe would come, that isolation would prove safer than solidarity, and that those with resources bore no special obligation to address the conditions producing the crises from which they sought to hide. Photographs of the wooden gate continued to circulate, reproduced in articles about billionaire retreats, inequality, and the future of Hawaiian land ownership. The gate remained visually unremarkable, vertical planks weathered to gray, simple hinges, a latch. Yet, in its simplicity, it functioned as those iron gates on old robber baron estates once did, as a symbol condensing complex realities into a single image. On one side, private world, engineered systems, curated landscape. On the other hand, public roads, mixed economy, uncertain futures. The echo of the gate closing was less about the privacy of one family, and more about a broader question that extended far beyond Kauai. What happens to a place when its most scenic edges become gated backdrops to lives primarily elsewhere? When wealth generated in California, data centers, or New York trading floors can purchase Hawaiian coastlines faster than local wages can afford local housing. When the most powerful tool for shaping community, property ownership, becomes concentrated in hands connected more to global capital flows than to the specific needs and histories of specific places. These questions were not new to the 21st century or even to Hawaii. They echoed through American history, from colonial land grabs, through westward expansion, through urban renewal, through gentrification. Each era found new legal and economic mechanisms for translating wealth into territorial control, and each generated resistance from those displaced or excluded. What changed across time was scale and speed, how quickly money could move, how much could concentrate, how thoroughly it could reshape the landscape before communities could organize effective responses. Ko'olau Ranch stood as one data point in a much larger pattern, remarkable primarily for its visibility, the prominence of its owner, the magnitude of its cost, the intensity of media scrutiny it attracted. In that visibility lay both its significance and its vulnerability. Unlike compounds owned by lower-profile billionaires, Zuckerberg's Kauai estate could not escape attention. Every new acquisition, every construction permit, every interaction with the county government became potential news, subject to investigation and public debate. The architecture of privacy could keep cameras out, but it could not keep the story contained. In 2023 and 2024, as construction continued behind the wall, the public's most detailed views of Ko'olau Ranch came from two sources: aerial imagery, captured by drones and news helicopters, and ground-level photography by journalists, granted limited access to roads and vantage points at the property's periphery. Wired's photo essay by Phil Young became one of the most widely circulated visual documents. The main gate, framed in afternoon light, the stone wall running along Ko'olau Road, distant buildings glimpsed from public access points, and a guard tower overlooking Larson's Beach. These images, carefully composed and technically proficient, formed an emergent archive, not unlike the early 20th century photographs of Gilded Age mansions taken by architectural photographers or curious passers-by. They captured specific textures, the irregular face of stacked basalt in late afternoon light, each stone casting its own small shadow. The sheen of metal on the guard tower, industrial material in a pastoral setting. The weathered gray of the wooden gate, its grain visible, its hardware simple but substantial. Sound was necessarily absent from still images, but implied: distant surf, passing cars on the public road, perhaps the faint mechanical hum of generators or air conditioning systems beyond the frame. Wired's diagrams, reproduced from planning documents, added another layer to this archive. Floor plans showed the layout of the main houses, indicating room functions and spatial relationships with the clarity of architectural drafting. Site plans revealed the compound's extent and organization, where buildings clustered, where infrastructure ran, where boundaries fell. These diagrams transformed confidential planning documents into public knowledge, making visible an architecture designed specifically to avoid visibility. For architectural historians accustomed to reconstructing vanished estates from fragments, a surviving drawing, a society column description, a real estate brochure, the Ko'olau Ranch archive presented an inversion. The estate was being documented before completion, its emerging architecture captured in real time rather than reconstructed from memory. The documentation occurred not because the owners chose transparency, but because the project's scale, cost, and controversial history made it a subject of journalistic interest that could not be suppressed despite efforts to control information flow. Context is revealing. Architectural historians often work with postcards of demolished mansions, faded photographs showing grand staircases or ballrooms now vanished, blueprints stored in archives whose collections outlived the buildings they describe. For Ko'olau Ranch, that archive was being created in advance, assembled by journalists and concerned community members who understood that documentation itself was a form of accountability, a way of ensuring that claims about the project could be verified or contested. The irony was stark and noted by multiple commentators. Zuckerberg's business empire, Facebook, Instagram, Meta, was built on the circulation of images and information, on platforms designed to make sharing frictionless and to monetize attention at global scale. Yet his Kauai compound was built on the opposite principle, control of images and information, NDAs that restricted circulation, security systems designed to prevent unauthorized documentation. The juxtaposition suggested a deep ambivalence about visibility, profitable when it involved other people's data, threatening when it involved his own private spaces. Every attempt to manage perception produced new documents subject to public records laws or journalistic scrutiny. Legal filings related to the quiet title actions became source material for news articles. Ethics disclosures about political consultants created a paper trail connecting private development to public officials. Construction permits filed with the county revealed project details that could be analyzed and reported. Press statements responding to controversies themselves became artifacts preserved in news archives subject to future analysis. The architecture of secrecy generated its own counter-archive, a trail of attempts at control that documented precisely what they sought to conceal. In this sense, Kauai Ranch was already an imagined ruin, a place most people would never physically enter but could encounter through mediated representations. The wooden gate in Jung's photograph functioned as a synecdoche, a part standing for an inaccessible whole, a symbol that could circulate globally while the actual compound remained restricted to a handful of approved visitors. The gate's image became more important in terms of public consciousness than the gate's material reality. Most people who formed opinions about Kauai Ranch would never touch that wood, never stand before that stone, never hear the actual sound of the latch engaging. They would know the estate only through photographs, articles, diagrams, representations once removed from physical experience. This was not unique to Kauai Ranch. Most historical architecture exists for most people only as representation, images in books, frames in documentaries, virtual tours online. Physical access to significant buildings is always constrained by distance, cost, and permission. What distinguished the Kauai case was the degree to which representation was contested, with owners seeking to minimize documentation while critics sought to maximize it, and with each image or article becoming a small battle in a larger conflict over who controlled the estate's meaning. The photographs showed a landscape in transition, construction equipment visible in some frames, portions of buildings rising, excavation scars not yet healed by landscaping. The images captured the compound in its vulnerable state before completion could impose the finished appearance that architectural photography typically emphasizes. Exposed rebar, stacked materials, raw earth, these elements made visible the labor and process usually erased from final presentations. Local news outlets supplemented Wired's documentation with their own coverage. Video footage from public roads showing trucks entering and leaving. Interviews with neighbors describing the wall's impact. Aerial shots revealing the compound's scale relative to surrounding properties. Each news cycle added to the archive, creating a cumulative record that no amount of after-the-fact reputation management could fully counteract. The estate was being documented into existence as much as it was being built into existence, with the documentation shaping public understanding in ways that would persist regardless of how the actual structures aged or were used. The texture of this archive was mixed: professional photography with high production values, alongside grainy phone images posted to social media. Carefully researched investigative articles next to community blog posts mixing fact with speculation. The quality varied, but the volume was significant, ensuring that future inquiries into the estate would have substantial source material, unlike historical estates whose early years are sparsely documented and must be reconstructed from scattered clues. What future generations would make of this archive remained uncertain. Perhaps Kauai Ranch would stand for centuries, its current controversies fading into obscurity as new ownership or uses transformed its meaning. Perhaps it would be demolished within decades, its brief existence becoming a case study in hubris and excess. Perhaps it would be converted to institutional use, its bunker repurposed for storage, its tree houses becoming educational exhibits. The photographs and articles being created in tiers. The 2020s would outlast any of these scenarios, providing evidence of what was built, why it was contested, and how it reflected the anxieties and inequalities of its era. The wooden gate would endure in image even if the physical gate eventually rotted or was replaced. That photographic permanence, the afterlife of objects as representations, was perhaps the truest legacy of any built environment in the age of digital documentation. Buildings can be demolished, but their images circulate indefinitely, detached from place, available for endless recontextualization and interpretation. The gate that closed to keep observers out had, paradoxically, been opened to global view through the very act of trying to protect it from observation. On another part of Kauai's shoreline, miles from Ko'olau Ranch, the Cocoa Palms Resort sat in arrested decay. The property had been famous once, featured in Elvis Presley's 1961 film, Blue Hawaii, its tropical modernist architecture and lagoon setting defining a particular vision of Hawaiian paradise for mainland tourists. Hurricane Iniki struck in September 1992, a Category 4 storm whose winds and surge left the resort structurally damaged and economically non-viable. In the decades since, the site remained largely untouched. Roofs collapsed, walls crumbled, vegetation reclaimed courtyards where guests had once sipped drinks poolside. Photographs of cocoa palms in ruin circulated online, attracting urban explorers and photographers drawn to tropical decay. The images showed palm fronds growing through broken windows, pools drained and cracked, mid-century furniture rotting in abandoned lobbies. The aesthetic was striking, a memento mori in concrete and rebar, proof that even structures built for pleasure and profit could become, within a single generation, ruins indistinguishable from ancient sites, except for the plastic and metal that marked their modernity. Efforts to rebuild cocoa palms had been tangled for years in debates over native Hawaiian rights, competing development visions, and the challenge of financing renovation at a scale matching the original resort's ambition. Some families claimed ancestral connections to land beneath the resort. Some cultural practitioners argued the site held significance requiring different treatment than standard commercial redevelopment. The legal and cultural complexity prevented simple solutions, leaving the property in limbo, neither demolished nor restored, a gap in the shoreline where commerce had once thrived. Further inland, at the Koloko Reservoir, another disaster had inscribed itself into Kauai's recent memory. On March 14, 2006, the earthen dam holding back the reservoir failed catastrophically. A wall of water, estimated at 1.6 million tons, surged downstream without warning. 7 people died, including a mother and her infant son, swept away in their home. The dam's owner, James Pfluger, was later found to have performed illegal grading above the dam and blocked spillways, actions that investigators determined contributed directly to the failure. The aftermath involved protracted litigation. Pfluger eventually pleaded no contest to felony reckless endangerment and was sentenced to prison time he did not serve due to poor health. A $25 million settlement was reached with property owners affected by the flood, including high-profile landowners like singer Bette Midler. The ranch land associated with the tragedy, part of Pfluger's holdings, was later purchased by Zuckerberg as part of his expanding estate, folding a disaster site into the Ko'olau portfolio without public controversy, but with quiet recognition among locals that the land carried history beyond its current use. These sites, Cocoa Palms and Koloko, were not part of Ko'olau Ranch's architecture, but they inhabited the same island narrative. They demonstrated patterns, large private projects encountering hurricanes, negligence, economic downturns, or shifting public values. Their ruins and consequences illustrated that no matter how carefully engineered, built environments in Hawaii remained vulnerable to both natural forces and human error. The tropical climate, beautiful in promotional materials, was also aggressive in its impacts on construction. Salt air corroded metal, humidity rotted wood, storms tested structures against forces that exceeded design assumptions. For architectural historians, the sound at Cocoa Palms today, wind moving through palm fronds, loose shutters banging intermittently, the absence of human voices where crowds once gathered, spoke as eloquently as any architectural review written when the resort opened. The cool, damp texture of moss on cracked concrete, the sight of ferns reclaiming a courtyard, the smell of decay and new growth intermingled, all testified to processes that operated on timescales indifferent to human intentions. Tropical climates and deferred maintenance could turn luxury into jungle within a single generation, a transformation both visually dramatic and philosophically instructive. The earthen scar where Koloko Dam had stood remained visible years after the failure, a wound in the landscape where repair efforts had stabilized but not erased the evidence of catastrophe. The sound of water had been central to the reservoir's function, the controlled flow through spillways, the lapping against earthen walls, the managed release for irrigation. The sound of failure, a roar heard by those close enough to survive its approach, marked a transition from human control to natural force, from engineered landscape to destructive flood. Ko'olau Ranch stood in stark contrast to these examples, new, reinforced, designed with redundancy and modern engineering standards. Its water systems were professionally maintained, its structures met or exceeded building codes, its insurance and legal protections were comprehensive. The compound was not vulnerable in the ways cocoa palms and Koloko had been. It was not deferred maintenance or illegal grading that threatened it, yet its context was not blank. It rose in a landscape where other forever projects had already become photographs and case studies, where ambitious plans had met consequences their designers had not fully anticipated. The wooden gate at Ko'olau, seen against this context, appeared less as the entrance to a guaranteed refuge, and more as an opening into a chapter of a longer island story about ambition and impermanence. Every wall ever built promised permanence. Many stood for centuries, many more lasted decades or less before demolition, adaptation, or ruin transformed them. Hawaiian history was particularly rich with such examples. Royal palaces converted to government buildings, plantation infrastructure repurposed or abandoned, military installations from various conflicts now museums or demolition sites. The question for Ko'olau Ranch was not whether it would eventually change. All buildings change through use, maintenance, ownership transitions, and environmental stress, but what form that change would take. Would the estate pass to heirs who maintained it as a family retreat? Would it be sold to new owners with different visions? Would changing climate conditions, sea level rise, intensifying storms, drought, stress systems designed for 20th century baselines? Would social or political shifts make vast private compounds untenable in ways their builders had not imagined? These were not predictions, but questions, the kind architectural historians learn to ask when viewing any structure, no matter how new or well built. Buildings accumulate history. They do not escape it. The newest mansion shares architectural fate with ancient ruins, both subject to time, both dependent on continued maintenance and cultural relevance to preserve their forms and functions. The lessons from cocoa palms and Koloko were not about specific engineering failures or financial miscalculations, but about hubris, the assumption that money and planning could fully control outcomes in environments as dynamic as Kauai's. The island's beauty derived partly from its volatility. The rain that kept it green also caused floods. The trade winds that cooled also carried salt that corroded. The volcanic soils that grew abundant vegetation also slumped and shifted under construction. Working with these forces required humility, local knowledge, and acceptance of limits. Working against them invited eventual consequences, often delayed but rarely avoided entirely. Whether Ko'olau Ranch embodied sufficient humility would be tested by time, storms, and the complex interplay of social, economic, and environmental factors that determined which structures endured and which became cautionary tales. The compound's fate was not yet written, but the island already held enough ruined ambitions to suggest that certainty about permanence was itself a kind of architectural vulnerability. On a quiet morning, in 2025, the stone wall along Ko'olau Road cast its familiar band of shade onto the grass growing at its base. The wooden gate, weathered now by several years of salt air and tropical sun, retained its function despite visible aging. The wood's gray patina deepening, a few boards showing the beginnings of warping that would eventually require replacement. The gate opened and closed for trucks delivering materials, staff commuting to work, and occasional guests arriving for stays whose duration and purpose remained private. Inside the compound, cattle grazed on pastures managed according to rotational grazing plans, native and introduced trees grew according to landscaping designs that balanced aesthetics with erosion control, and the underground shelter sat beneath volcanic soil, its reinforced door closed, its mechanical systems humming softly on periodic maintenance cycles. Elsewhere on the property, beyond the main compound's carefully maintained grounds, a modest fence enclosed the native Hawaiian burial area associated with the family of Julian Ako. The fence showed signs of its own exposure, rust forming at joints, wire mesh slightly sagging in one section, but it continued to serve its purpose, marking sacred space, keeping livestock out, signaling to anyone who encountered it that this patch of earth operated under different protocols than surrounding ranch land. Inside the fence, grass grew taller than on the managed pastures, and volunteers had at some point planted native shrubs that now provided a green backdrop to the simple markers that identified the site's significance. The light illuminating both areas was the same Pacific sunlight, filtered through clouds that moved with the trade winds, creating patterns of sun and shadow that shifted across the landscape according to rhythms unchanged by human construction. The material beneath was the same volcanic earth, the same basalt bedrock, the same soils built up over millennia from weathered rock and organic matter. The sound was the same wind, though its acoustic character varied, open on the pastures, muffled among trees, partially blocked by walls and buildings, but fundamentally the same force moving through the same island topography. In the history of private estates, patterns of transformation have been more common than patterns of permanence. Roman villas whose mosaics now form museum floors were once exclusive residences, closed to all but invited guests and household staff. Medieval castles, built as fortifications and demonstrations of lordly power, became over centuries state properties, tourist attractions, or romantic ruins. The great country houses of England, maintained for generations by aristocratic families, transitioned in the 20th century to institutional use, schools, hotels, event venues, as taxation and changing social structures made single-family occupancy economically unfeasible. American Gilded Age estates followed similar trajectories, though compressed into shorter time frames that reflected American wealth's volatility and the nation's relative newness. The vast Newport cottages were built in the 1880s and 1890s, fell out of private family use by the 1920s and 1930s, and became museums by mid-century. Biltmore in North Carolina, largest of the Gilded Age estates, remained in family hands but opened to paying visitors in 1930, transitioning from purely private space to commercial attraction. The architectural grandeur survived, but the meaning transformed from demonstration of private wealth to democratized spectacle, spaces where admission tickets granted access once reserved for society's most privileged. It is impossible and irresponsible to predict the precise fate of Kauai Ranch. The factors determining any building's future are too numerous, too interactive, and too dependent on contingencies that cannot be foreseen. Economic shifts, family dynamics, political changes, environmental pressures, technological transformations, and pure chance all play roles in whether structures endure in their original form, adapt to new uses, or disappear entirely. What can be said with confidence is that the estate's legacy will depend less on the thickness of its walls than on the stories people tell about it. Those stories were already being written in investigative articles and community conversations, in lawsuits and grant announcements, in photographs taken from public roads and oral histories collected by cultural practitioners. The stories contained multitudes, accounts of jobs created and neighbors excluded, of conservation land preserved and ancestral lands contested, of philanthropic generosity and legal maneuvering, of architectural ambition and community anxiety. For historians examining Kauai Ranch decades hence, the documentary record will be unusually rich. Detailed planning documents, extensive media coverage, public records documenting land transactions and political relationships, photographic archives capturing the compound in various states of completion. Future scholars will have resources that would be the envy of anyone researching most historical estates, for which evidence is often fragmentary and indirect. They will be able to reconstruct not just what was built, but how it was received, how it was justified, and how it reflected the tensions of its era. The final image worth considering is not one of collapse, but of relation. The wooden gate in the stone wall stands as a threshold between public road and private domain, a physical boundary marking where one set of rules gives way to another. A short distance inland, the fence around burial grounds marks a different kind of boundary, one governed not by property law but by cultural protocol and respect for ancestors. Beyond both, the shoreline remains legally public, subject to Hawaiian law guaranteeing access even where surrounding land is private. These three boundaries, gate, fence, shoreline, define different architectures of belonging. The gate asserts ownership and control, the power to admit or exclude, according to private determination. The fence acknowledges limits to ownership, spaces where ancestral presence constrains what living owners can do with land they legally possess. The shoreline represents a refusal of total privatization, a legal framework that maintains some places as commons, regardless of surrounding ownership patterns. The cool stone of the wall beneath a hand, if one were allowed to touch it, would feel like stone anywhere. Rough texture, variable temperature depending on sun exposure, slight porosity where moisture had penetrated. The warmth of weathered wood in the gate, if one could press against it, would carry the particular softness wood develops through years of expansion and contraction in humid climates. The echo of footsteps on the road, if one walked past while the compound was quiet, would sound like footsteps on any rural road, scuff of shoe on pavement, slight crunch where gravel had blown onto asphalt, the ambient rhythm of human movement through landscape. These sensory threads connect private ambition to a shared world. The compound was designed to be a system apart, capable of functioning independently, insulated from disruptions affecting broader society. Yet, it remained embedded in landscape, subject to climate and weather, dependent on labor drawn from community and visible, despite its walls, to observers whose documentation ensured that it could not fully control its own meaning. In this sense, Koalau Ranch was already a kind of ruin in advance, a place whose significance would inevitably drift beyond its owner's intentions, whose story would be told and retold in forms that reflected interpreters' values as much as builders' designs. The compound was engineered to withstand hurricanes, droughts, and potential social collapse. History suggested that what would endure longest was neither bunker nor mansion, but the role the estate played as case study, an example of how, in the early 21st century, extraordinary wealth sought to build fortresses against time on land where time had always belonged to many. It was meant to last as long as money could buy. But in architectural history, forever is usually measured not in centuries of stone, but in the thin, fragile life of photographs and memories, images of gates and walls that once seemed immovable, and of the communities that lived in their shadow, whose stories outlasted the structures designed to exclude them.